Hello, welcome back to the Frank Crowley Courthouse. I'm Judge Shaquita Kelly, the presiding judge of County Criminal Court number 11. I'm here with my colleague Dan Patterson. He is the presiding judge of County Criminal Court number 1. We're going to talk about DWIs and license suspensions today. Dan Patterson hears a lot of those cases. Can you tell us what the requirements are for DWI suspension?
I can give you the general guidelines. It's a very convoluted part of the law. Believe it or not, it seems very straightforward, but it's not. There's a lot of complications involved, and the situation is going to depend on the particular person and the situation. But let's just talk about it because we need to narrow it down a little bit.
Okay.
I will narrow it down to somebody who's been arrested for the first time DWI,
All right.
and they're over 21, because under 21 complicates things tremendously, and multiple DWIs does as well. Okay, so in that situation, and first of all, little public service, please don't drink and drive.
Right.
Whatever you do,
Don't do it.
please just don't. I mean, nobody plans to, don't get me wrong. I just think there's so many other options out there these days, and if you're going to go out on the weekend, plan on the ride share, download the apps for these folks.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just so simple.
Right.
So simple to do, and it's just not worth it. Just the expense alone, not to mention the other horrible things that can happen. I mean, the expense alone, they claim it's around $10,000 to be arrested for DWI, from arrest to conviction through the whole thing.
10,000?
And even more if you go to trial and things, it can be a whole lot more than that. So
if you appeal it, then yeah.
Oh, even more.
Yeah.
So it's a huge expense on top of everything else. So just don't do it. So suspensions, driver's license suspensions for, again, first timers over 21. What happens is, when you get arrested, what do the police do? Well, they try to gather evidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want to make sure that they have their case to go to court, and so they're going to see about trying to get as much evidence as they can against you, which includes seeing what your blood alcohol is going to be at the time of driving. And how do they do that? Well, several ways, but most likely these days it's going to be either a breath test or a blood test, okay? They're going to ask you for that, and when you get back to the jail, they're going to ask you for that. And if you consent, this is important, if you consent to one of those tests, and if it comes back over the legal limit of 0.08 or more, then there's going to be a suspension of your license. But it's only going to be, at that point, it's going to be a 6-month suspension.
Okay.
Okay.
So if you consent, it's 6 months.
Yes.
All right.
And so if you say I don't want to, I'm not going to consent, refuse, then it's going to be a longer suspension period. Did I say 6 months? I meant 90 days.
90 days.
90 days.
Okay.
90 days. And it's going to, if you do not consent, if you say no, they're going to most likely get a warrant for your blood anyway and take your blood. Okay. And if it comes back again over the legal limit, then the suspension period is going to be 180 days.
Okay. So it goes up if you refuse.
It does. There's a consequence for refusing. They try to give you a benefit if you cooperate, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So that's the deal. So that's the first level, okay? And then once that happens, well, you're stuck for a little while because you got the suspension. We'll talk about what the remedy is for that a little bit later on.
Okay.
But the second part is when you come to court, okay? Obviously your case is still pending, so what's going to happen in your case? You're going to either go to trial or you're going to work out a plea bargain agreement. And whatever happens there, if you get a conviction, if you plead guilty and get a conviction, or you go to trial and get a conviction, there's going to be possibly another suspension of your license on top of the first suspension, of the LR suspension, believe it or not. So it gets very complicated. I'm trying not to speak too fast, but it's a lot we're trying to cram in here for a short period of time. And so basically what happens then is if you get convicted, if you plead guilty, most people get probation. And first-time DWIs, they just do. And if you do, the benefit is that you get to take the DWI education course, which you won't get another suspension if you complete that within 180 days of getting your probation. If you don't, if you take jail time, you say, no, I just want to sit my time out, I don't want probation, then it's going to be another suspension, I'm sorry, based on the conviction, on top of the one you've already had. So believe it or not. So it gets very complicated, and so that suspension period is going to be anywhere from 90 days, it's up to the judge at this point, 90 days up to a year, depending on the situation.
If you get a conviction and you don't take that class.
If you don't take the class, you don't take probation.
Okay.
Exactly, so that's on top of that. So, and the judge at that point can give you, if you're asked and you think that the judge thinks it's proper to give them credit for the LR suspension if they had one before.
Right.
Against them. So there may not be too much of another suspension, but there could be.
So if you're already suspended the ALR suspension was 60 days and then you plead guilty, they can ask for you to take some of that suspension off of the time they've already been suspended.
That's true.
Okay.
You give credit for it, basically.
What happens if you get a DWI second with your license?
Oh, that gets so much more complicated. So much more complicated in so many more ways. This kind of gets into the next subject, which is what is the remedy? Because we live in Dallas, Texas, and everybody's got to drive, right? We don't live in, you know, some place that has, that has good mass transit. So we're kind of stuck, and they recognize that we have to get to work or get to school. So you can get what's called an occupational driver's license when your license is suspended, which is a limited purpose permit to allow you to go basically to work and to school. For your essential needs is what they call it, okay?
Is there a time limit on how long your occupational license can last?
It's going to last as long as the suspension period is, generally speaking.
Okay.
And so whatever the suspension period is, that's what it should cover.
Okay.
But it's limited. I mean, it's limited as far as, generally speaking, as far as time, geographical area maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the judges, most of the time these days, they put an interlock as a condition of getting your occupational.
So you can't go drive to a birthday party and hang out?
No, the ignition interlock is going to, you know, put that to an end.
Okay.
You know, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but
Right.
again, it's expensive. I mean,
It
that's
is.
another expense on top of everything else. The interlock device is not cheap, and just getting the occupational is not inexpensive either. That's about $265 now, I think, for a filing fee. And so it's just not worth it. Please just don't drink and drive.
Don't drink and drive.
That's really the bottom line.
It is.
And I've gone through this very fast, and I'm sorry.
No,
but,
you're good. You did good. I think you got the point across. You guys see all the consequences that could happen from one drink.
That's true, and that's just your first timer
Yeah.
with no priors, and you're over 21. If it's anything else, it gets very, very complicated, and you just have to look at individual situation to figure out what your options are.
So do you think you'll come back and talk to us about DWI seconds maybe at another
Oh, I'll
time?
be happy to.
Okay.
I'll be happy to talk about anything you want.
Okay. Thank you, Judge.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate
You
it.
did a great job. Thanks.